Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
In part 1 of this series, the archive covered several hypotheses regarding the origin of the Moon. The giant impact hypothesis, the immediate origin post-impact satellite hypothesis, the multiple impacts hypothesis, the Synestia Hypothesis, the capture hypothesis, the accretion hypothesis, and the nuclear explosion hypothesis. We also discussed the 4,000-year-old explanation found in the Enuma Elish. And finally, we addressed the moon landing hoax in no uncertain terms. In this presentation, the archive catalogs some of the most stunning moon anomalies over the last 60-plus years. Indeed, there are several anomalies over the last 6 decades to which NASA and its astronauts have responded dismissively. These anomalies are fueled by transcripts and unexplained photographs, some of which have only been declassified within the past decade. Whether there is any validity to these theories is up for debate, but some are so compelling they cannot be ignored. More importantly, many of these anomalies remain unexplained by the space agency. As mentioned before, the archive explained the various origin theories regarding the Moon in Part 1. However, one particular hypothesis was omitted because we felt it was better suited for this presentation. It is known as the hollow moon hypothesis and is sometimes called the Spaceship Moon hypothesis. Between 1969 and 1977, seismometers installed on the Moon by the Apollo missions recorded moonquakes. The Moon was described as ringing like a bell during some of those quakes, specifically the shallow ones. This phrase was brought to popular attention in March 1970 in an article in Popular Science. When Apollo 12 landed on the Moon in November of 1969, seismic devices registered the impact spanning a 40-mile range. Astonishingly, the object rang like a bell for over 35 minutes. On the following mission, NASA decided to send a heavier rocket and document the results. Apollo 13 was deployed, and its module struck with the equivalence of 11 tons of TNT. For 3 hours, the planetoid reverberated with sound similar to a massive gong. Such acoustics would be physically impossible for a solid mass to produce.
Houston, we have a problem.
In 1970, Michael Vassin and Alexander Cherbakov of the Soviet Academy of Sciences advanced a hypothesis that the Moon is a spaceship created by unknown beings. The article was entitled, "Is the Moon the Creation of Alien Intelligence?" and was published in Sputnik, the Soviet equivalent of Reader's Digest. The hypothesis was reported in the West that same year. It relies heavily on the suggestion that large lunar craters, assumed to be formed from meteor impacts, are generally too shallow and have flat or even convex bottoms. They hypothesize that small meteors are making a cup-shaped depression in the rocky surface of the Moon, while the larger meteors are drilling through a rocky layer and hitting an armored hull underneath. The last time a person officially visited the moon was in December 1972 during NASA's Apollo 17 mission. The reasons for not returning in over 50 years are claimed to be budgetary and political, not scientific or technical. But many skeptics do not accept this explanation, and they point to an event which happened on the Apollo 11 mission when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin first reached the surface of the moon. Shortly after the Apollo 11 lunar module Eagle touched down on the moon, there was a very strange 2-minute gap in the public radio transmissions. What happened in those 2 minutes has been the subject of a lot of controversy, with many researchers pointing out that the individual medical channels for both astronauts were being used to communicate privately. A strange report claims to be a transcript between Armstrong and Aldrin witnessing extraterrestrial spacecraft and structures once they exited the lunar module. The transcript is as follows. "Those are giant things. No, this is not an optical illusion. No one is going to believe this." What? What the hell is happening? What's wrong with you? "They're here, under the surface." What's there? "Emission interrupted. Interference control calling Apollo 11. We saw some visitors. They were here for a while, observing the instruments." Repeat your last information. "I say that there were other spaceships. They're lined up in the other side of the crater." "Let us sound the orbiter in 625-5, automatic relay connected. My hands are shaking so badly I can't do anything. Film it? God, if these damned cameras have picked up anything, what then?" "Have you picked up anything?" "I didn't have any film at hand. 3 shots of the saucers or whatever they were that were ruining the film." Control here. Are you on your way? What is the uproar over the UFOs, over?" "They've landed there. There they are, and they're watching us." The mirrors, have you set them up?" "Yes, they're in the right place, but whoever made those spaceships surely can come tomorrow and remove them. Over and out." What is interesting about this story, though, is the fact that within 30 minutes of landing on the moon, the story was circulating around NASA that they saw something on the rim of the crater and were all upset. They didn't know what to do or if they should go out. Neil Armstrong is said to have disclosed his account of what he and Aldrin saw to an unnamed professor during a NASA symposium. What really happened out there with Apollo 11? It was incredible, of course. We had always known there was a possibility. The fact is, we were warned off. There was never any question then of a space station or a moon city. How do you mean warned off? I can't go into details except to say that their ships were far superior to ours both in size and technology. Boy, were they big and menacing. No, there is no question of a space station. But NASA had other missions after Apollo 11. Naturally, NASA was committed at that time and couldn't risk a panic on Earth, but it really was a quick scoop and back again. Interestingly, Soviet scientists were allegedly the first to confirm the incident. According to our information, the encounter was reported immediately after the landing of the module, said Dr. Vladimir Azaza, a physicist and professor of mathematics at Moscow University. Neil Armstrong relayed the message to Mission Control that 2 large, mysterious objects were watching them after having landed near the moon module, but his message was never heard by the public because NASA censored it. According to another Soviet scientist, Dr. Alexander Kazantsev, Buzz Aldrin took color movie film of the UFOs from inside the module and continued filming them after he and Armstrong went outside. In 1979, Maurice Chatelain, former chief of NASA Communication Systems, confirmed that Armstrong had indeed reported seeing 2 UFOs on the rim of a crater. The encounter was common knowledge in NASA, he revealed, but nobody has talked about it until now. Chatelain also confirmed that Apollo 11's radio transmissions were interrupted on several occasions in order to hide the news from the public. Before dismissing Chatelain's sensational claims, it is worth noting his impressive background in the aerospace industry and space program. His first job after moving from France was as an electronics engineer with Convair, specializing in telecommunications, telemetry, and radar. In 1959, he oversaw an electromagnetic research group developing new radar and telecommunication systems for Ryan. One of his 11 patents was an automatic flights protocol to the moon. Later, at North American Aviation, Chatelain was offered the job of designing and building the Apollo communications and data processing systems. Chatelain claims that all Apollo and Gemini flights were followed, both at a distance and sometimes also quite closely, by space vehicles of extraterrestrial origin, flying saucers, or UFOs if you want to call them by that name. Every time it occurred, the astronauts informed Mission Control, who then ordered absolute silence. He goes on to say, I think that Walter Schirra aboard Mercury 8 was the first of the astronauts to use the codename Santa Claus to indicate the presence of flying saucers next to space capsules. However, his announcements were barely noticed by the general public. It was a little different when James Lovell on board the Apollo 8 command module came out from behind the moon and said for everybody to hear, "Please be informed that there is a Santa Claus." Even though this happened on Christmas Day 1968, many people sensed a hidden meaning in those words. While it's difficult to tell whether these conversations actually happened with the anonymous sources and classified information, one thing that stands out is the fact that NASA lost a significant amount of high-quality, slow-scan television footage that was made as backup for television broadcasts. One might ask how the most technologically advanced space program in the world managed to launch a rocket, putting men on the moon, and somehow just misplaced footage of it. Perhaps a secret U.S. Navy space program called NOVA can shed some more light on this matter. According to William Tompkins, a top aerospace designer who worked for major NASA corporate contractors, the U.S. Navy planned to put 10,000 people on the moon in the early 1970s as part of a secret lunar bases program that was to be established through the Apollo program. From 1967 to 1971, Tompkins worked for TRW, a leading aerospace corporation that built the first NASA satellite, Pioneer 1. TRW was responsible for a range of critical components used in Apollo spacecraft, and its personnel were in the operations center for Apollo missions. Tompkins' account of what really happened on the moon is explained in his recently published autobiography Selected by Extraterrestrials. Earlier, during the final 2 years of his 12-year employment at the Douglas Aviation Company, Tompkins' innovative designs for planned Apollo missions had greatly impressed Dr. Kurt H. DeBus, who was the first director of NASA's Launch Operations Center, which was later renamed the Kennedy Space Center. According to Tompkins, he and DeBus held many confidential meetings regarding the true purpose of the Apollo missions, which was a U.S. Navy space program called NOVA. The NOVA program sought to secretly establish military garrisons on the Moon, Mars, and nearby star systems. To support his radical claims, Tompkins provided several documents in his autobiography. The first is a 1963 Douglas Aviation Company study of the launch vehicles to be used in the covert NOVA program. The second is an April 15, 1963 memorandum from the Douglas Aviation Company. It confirms Tompkins' appointment by Dr. DeBus to the Launch Operations Center and the designs he was working on for NASA. Tompkins describes what he designed for the Apollo missions in NOVA, which included dozens of missions and spaceships designed for exploratory operations, a station to be built on Mars, NASA NOVA vehicles and equatorial launching facilities, and multiple 2,000-man military bases for our moon. During the Apollo 11 moon landing in July 1969, Tompkins says he was in the NASA Launch Operations Center at Cape Canaveral where television cameras from the Apollo lander provided a live feed of what was being witnessed by Armstrong and Aldrin. Tompkins explains how Armstrong and Aldrin were met by a fleet of extraterrestrial spaceships that were very close to the Apollo lunar lander. Armstrong panned his camera in a 360-degree motional all around the crater, and the CIA then classified the information as way above top secret. Tompkins drew a picture of what he witnessed on the Apollo live feed camera. As Tompkins explains, the extraterrestrials put up their no trespassing sign but allowed us to make several other additional Apollo landings to pick up a few rocks and play in the sand. The action of the extraterrestrials stopped our plans to build our manned naval base on the moon. The far side of the moon has a certain mystique about it. It's eternally out of view, never facing the Earth, which has earned it a misleading nickname, the dark side, as if sunlight never reaches its surface. Compared to the near side, the far side's terrain is rugged, with a multitude of impact craters and relatively few flat and dark lunar maria, which is seas, giving it an appearance closer to other barren places in the solar system such as Mercury and Callisto. It has one of the largest craters in the solar system, the South Pole-Aitken Basin. About 18% of the far side is occasionally visible from Earth due to libration. The remaining 82% remained unobserved until 1959, when it was photographed by the Soviet Luna 3 space probe. The Soviet Academy of Sciences published the first atlas of the far side of the moon in 1960. The Apollo 8 astronauts were the first humans to see the far side in person when they orbited the moon in 1968. All crewed and uncrewed soft landings had taken place on the near side of the moon until January 3, 2019, when the Chang'e 4 spacecraft made the first landing on the far side. Stories of intelligent artifacts and bases on the far side of the moon have been lurking in the shadows for decades since the Apollo years. We will be discussing several of these anomalies later in this presentation, but for now, we want to highlight an anomalous event that has been disclosed directly from the NASA archives. In the audio recordings from the Apollo 10 mission, astronaut Gene Cernan, who was piloting the lunar module, asked John Young, who was piloting the command module, if he hears that whistling sound. Cernan calls it music and says it even sounds outer spacey. Later, the two men asked Tom Stafford, who was in the lunar module with Cernan, if he hears it too. They agree that it's really weird, and Young says, "We're going to have to find out about that. Nobody will believe us."
Hey, when do we fire the helium tanks?
Not yet, babe.
Yeah. You want some more brownies?
No.
First, a little hungry.
That music even sounds outer spacey, doesn't it? You hear that? That whistling sound?
Yeah. Woo!
Look at your... Yeah, it sounds like, outer space type music. Hey, Tom, is your insulation all burned off here on the front side of your window over here? Right?
Yeah.
Mine's all burned off. Heading out here, where are you, John? Boy, that sure is weird music. No. It's a whistling, like an outer space type thing.
One explanation that tries to shed some scientific light onto what the astronauts may have heard is that it was the product of radio waves interacting with the magnetic field on the Moon. A similar sound was picked up and recorded recently by the Cassini spacecraft when it was orbiting Saturn. The only problem is that the Moon doesn't have a magnetic field like planets do. The scientific retort was that if it wasn't radio waves reacting with magnetic fields from the Moon, then it was simply interference between the VHF radios between the two Apollo 10 vehicles. Astronaut Al Worden, who flew on Apollo 15, disputed that explanation, saying, "Logic tells me that if there was something recorded on there, then there's something there." Interesting, it was a particular image from the Apollo 15 mission that was supposedly the impetus for the repurposed Apollo 20 mission. Now, you are likely aware that the Apollo 18, 19, and 20 missions were officially canceled by NASA. So, what is the story behind this so-called repurposed Apollo 20 mission? In 1971, during the Apollo 15 mission, this image was captured from lunar orbit of what looks to be a giant cigar-shaped craft. This photograph would eventually be part of a viral video 36 years later. In April 2007, videos began appearing on YouTube under the username RetiredAFB, telling the extraordinary story of Apollo 20. A secret lunar mission that definitely proved the existence of intelligent alien life on the Moon. Then, on May 23, 2007, Italian ufologist Luca Scantamburlo interviewed a man who identified himself as William Rutledge, a retired American astronaut living in Rwanda. Rutledge claimed to be the commander of the Apollo 20 crew and to be the owner of the retired AFB account. However, Scantamburlo never met Rutledge in person because he conducted the interview over Yahoo Messenger. During the interview, Rutledge claimed Apollo 20 was a top-secret mission launched in mid-August 1976 from Vandenberg Air Force Base in Lompoc, California, conducted jointly by the United States and the former Soviet Union. He alleged the other mission members were American Leona Snyder and former Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, the first human being to perform a spacewalk. The purported landing site of the mission was near Guyot Crater, a feature near the much larger Delport crater. Rutledge said the videos show that he and Leonov discovered the remains of an ancient lunar civilization. He also said they brought back artifacts to Earth for study, including a hibernating female humanoid. Despite the realistic appearance of the videos, amateurs have easily debunked them on YouTube and elsewhere on the internet. The creator of the video has been identified as French videographer artist Thierry Speth. Like many hoaxes, this story is a mixture of facts and fiction. The starting point for it are photos that NASA astronauts took in 1971 while in lunar orbit during the Apollo 15 mission. The photos show what looks like a cigar-shaped object resting in a lunar crater. The hoaxer apparently used these photos to create the image of a pock-marked alien spacecraft on the Moon. In truth, Apollo 20 was a mission that never flew. It was one of the 3 lunar missions NASA canceled after Congress reduced its funding, including Apollo missions 18 and 19. The last crewed lunar mission was Apollo 17, launched in 1972. The next crewed mission that used an Apollo spacecraft was Skylab 2, launched on May 25, 1973, followed by Skylab 3 and Skylab 4. Skylab 1 was an uncrewed mission that launched the Skylab space station into Earth orbit. The Skylab missions were followed by the Apollo-Soyuz test project, coordinated by the United States and the former Soviet Union in 1975. Some of the stages for the Saturn V rockets intended for NASA's 3 canceled lunar missions had already been constructed before their cancellation. According to the hoaxer's story, these were all used for the lunar landings of Apollo missions 18, 19, and 20. In reality, NASA used one of these to launch Skylab into orbit in 1973. The others are on display at 3 American space centers: the John F. Kennedy Space Center near Cape Canaveral, the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, and the United States Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. For the archive, this set of facts is sufficient in disproving the authenticity of this video. However, the video itself is highly evocative, and we have included the full-length version after the credits in this presentation. This particular topic is a very complicated one, but we will begin with what the archive considers the most important aspect of visual anomalies related to the Moon. If we go back before man ever took photographs or set foot on the Moon, we have what the archive considers the original anomaly that has been recorded for centuries: TLP. TLP, or transient lunar phenomena, are described as short-lived changes in the brightness of patches on the Moon's face. They can last from a few seconds to several hours and can sometimes grow from less than a few to several kilometers in size. Most cases of transient lunar phenomena are described as increases in the overall glow of a spot on the Moon. However, sometimes observers report a decrease in a region's brightness or even a change in color to red or violet. The reports of transient lunar phenomena have characterized them as mist, clouds, and volcanoes. This image of a TLP was taken by Leon Stewart on November 15, 1953. The transient lunar phenomena is the small bright spot in the center of the image. Many people have reported seeing transient lunar phenomena for at least 1,000 years. The viewer should keep in mind the preceding partial list did not include the last 120 plus years of reports. Once we reach the 20th century, the number of sightings of transient lunar phenomena skyrockets into the thousands. 2 extensive catalogs of transient lunar phenomena exist, with the most recent totaling 2,254 events going back to the 6th century. As for an explanation of TLPs, theories vary from meteorites hitting the Moon to gases being discharged from deep beneath the surface. However, despite flashing moonlights being recorded for centuries, scientists remain as puzzled as ever about their origin. Once we reach the second half of the 20th century, we find the introduction of photography into this discussion of lunar anomalies. Throughout the Apollo period and several years afterwards, thousands of photographs were taken of the lunar surface. Many of these photographs, which seem to indicate something anomalous, have become very well known among researchers of this topic. Here is a partial list of the most widely publicized images beginning in the 1960s. as the viewer no doubt can see, the quality of these images during this period can be less than ideal. This fact greatly increases the difficulty of making a convincing argument that these images contain artificial structures. The vast majority of NASA photographs have not been digitized and are only available on site in the Still Picture Research Room at the National Archives. The bulk of the images that are not digitized are institutional in nature. So while many of the public images from the Apollo years are of lesser quality, it is more than likely that the very clear analogs do exist. In fact, many have been released by NASA in the decades following the Apollo missions. And without getting into a deep discussion about how these public images may have been altered to emit certain objects, suffice it to say that NASA rarely, if ever, released an image that they did not want seen by the public. But even when it comes to new digital technology, many times what someone sees is not accurate. Take, for example, a news report that popped up in February 2016 titled "Mystery of Moon's Unnatural 4-Mile-High Spire Explained." On February 1st, the British news site Express reported an extraordinary claim that UFO chasers had supposedly discovered a tremendous, nearly 4-mile-high artificial spire bursting out from the surface of the moon. A YouTube channel, Mexico Geek, was cruising around Google Moon and came upon the dubious lunar structure and posted this video.
La luna sigue dando sorpresas, ahora se trata de una enorme torre en Google Moon. Si observamos detenidamente este cráter, podremos darnos cuenta cómo sobresale una enorme torre. Fácilmente se puede ver cómo en medio del cráter se eleva una estructura alargada, inclusive se puede ver que dicha estructura es de un color más oscuro que el resto del paisaje alrededor, y se puede ver del lado izquierdo la enorme sombra que produce la torre.
At first glance, the object in question does look like a tall tower, and the visible angle almost makes it seem three-dimensional. But is it really? This Google Moon composite image shows exactly where this spire is on the moon. Noah Petro, Deputy Project Scientist for the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO mission, which is currently orbiting the moon, stated, "That's no spire. What is going on is that there is a small crater that formed on the rim, after the larger crater Mersenius E." While some images shown in the video are from Google Earth and photographed by the Clementine mission which orbited the moon in the 1990s, Petro provided newer, clearer LRO images. The composite image shows the same object on the left from Google Earth and the right is from the LROC. Petro explained, "The LROC team has produced an image mosaic of the moon's surface when the sun is high in the sky. Part of the Clementine mission image shows a seam between two images that were mosaicked together to form the larger view. In the high sun images, the bright craters are more easily seen, but there's nothing there that is unusual compared to any other areas on the moon." But what about the notion that the spire looks three-dimensional depending on how you turn the perspective of the picture? The next LROC low-sun images put a damper on all of that, especially when the spire seems to disappear. The sun is so low on the horizon in the right side image, such that the dimple in the crater wall casts a shadow on the eastern wall of the crater, said Petro. There is a dark cascade of material falling into the larger crater, likely caused by material falling into the crater floor. No spire there, it's an optical illusion. The archive would like to iterate that although many of the older images used as evidence of anomalies on the moon are not the best quality, and subsequently have been disproven with updated imagery equipment such as the LROC, it by no means leads to a conclusion that there is nothing anomalous occurring on the moon. Clementine was the first U.S. spacecraft launched to the moon in over 20 years and the mission took place between January 25, 1994 and August 8, 1994. It was a joint space project where the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization participated together with NASA to do some research on the Moon. It was the Clementine mission that found water on the Moon's poles. Former deputy manager of the mission, John Brandenburg, claims that the U.S. government is aware there is an extraterrestrial presence near Earth. Dr. Brandenburg is a well-known and respected plasma physicist who has worked on plasma technologies, nuclear fusion, and advanced space propulsion for NASA, and invented the microwave electrothermal plasma thruster using water propellant for space propulsion. So, in other words, he is a very credible source. Brandenburg states that the real purpose of Clementine was a photo reconnaissance mission, basically to check out if someone was building bases on the Moon that we didn't know about and if they were expanding them. In addition to this, accounts from former military intelligence officials have claimed there is more on the dark side of the Moon than NASA is letting on. Carl Wolf, a technician at the Air Force Tactical Air Command headquarters in Langley, Virginia, analyzed data from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, claiming he and his colleagues viewed artificial structures on the dark side of the Moon, including radar antennas and structures made by intelligent beings. The archive finds it significantly more compelling when officials like these who are directly involved in these missions come forward to disclose inside knowledge that the public would not otherwise gain. Our own Moon has one of the largest preserved craters in the solar system, the South Pole-Aitken Basin, located on the far side of the satellite. The area is at the center of many investigations, with various orbiters and even the Chinese lander Chang'e 4 studying the region. In April 2019, researchers discovered something anomalous underneath its surface. In the journal Geophysical Research Letters, planetary scientists have claimed to discover a structure that weighs 2.18 billion kilograms and stretches for more than 300 kilometers in depth. Imagine taking a pile of metal 5 times larger than the Big Island of Hawaii and burying it underground. That's roughly how much unexpected mass we detected, lead author Peter B. James from Baylor University said in a statement. The discovery was possible thanks to NASA's Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory mission, which measures subtle changes in the gravitational field of the Moon. When we combined that with lunar topography data from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, we discovered the unexpectedly large amount of mass hundreds of miles underneath the South Pole-Aitken Basin, James said. One of the explanations of this extra mass is that the metal from the asteroid that formed this crater is still embedded in the Moon's mantle. So, here we have a pile of metal the size of Hawaii under the surface of the Moon that has been confirmed by planetary scientists. While they say their best guess is an ancient asteroid, it is a guess nonetheless. A large artificial underground base might very well be another explanation, but not one that will ever be publicly acknowledged by academics or researchers. On June 24, 2022, NASA released images of the lunar crash site taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in May. According to the space agency, whatever did hit the Moon's surface did so on March 4th after being detected on a trajectory with the Moon in late 2021. The Moon is covered in craters, several from rocket component impacts, but this new one is unique because it's 2 separate overlapping points of impact. Whatever hit the Moon did so in a way that made an 18-meter crater overlapping a 16-meter one. As NASA noted, that implies that each end of the rocket had a large amount of mass, uncommon for these kinds of impacts. Here's the crazy thing. No one knows where the rocket came from. NASA is able to say the rocket was at least in space late 2021 on its way to a hard crash with the moon, but as to who sent it or why remains a mystery. And outside of NASA, the U.S. Space Command, Space Force, and even the wider Department of Defense are all quiet. Why doesn't NASA know? After all, it is NASA. Plus, the moon is relatively close. The United States and its allies have satellites, telescopes, and enough tracking software to keep an eye on what is going on in space and from where. Rocket launches are traceable. Every time North Korea tests out a ballistic missile, the intelligence and military world is pretty quick to identify the path, range, and possible launch point. Early on, SpaceX and the Chinese Chang'e 5 T1 rocket were suspected, but both have since been excluded as the likely source. As of May 2023, the rocket that crashed into the moon remains a mystery. The archive understands many viewers of this presentation may feel as though we produced a debunking video in some respects. Indeed, in some respects, that's exactly what we did. Early on, we became conflicted with the original transcript of this video because as we investigated and researched certain aspects, we found convincing rebuttals. This was especially true of the older Apollo mission images. Actually, we run into this phenomenon periodically when focusing on ancient astronauts. The phenomenon where a third party makes a claim in support of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, but the evidence presented is just not convincing or compelling. A wise man once said that smart people can listen to other smart people and change their minds. The archive says that smart people can listen to dumb people and call bullshit. But just like with the ancient astronaut hypothesis where we try to put forth the most compelling arguments with balance, so too here with the topic of lunar anomalies and an alien presence, we have attempted to put forth a balanced observation. To be clear, the archive wholeheartedly believes there may be evidence of extraterrestrial structures on our moon. However, we do not hang our hat on outdated NASA imagery. We draw our conclusion from eyewitness testimonies provided by individuals involved in the missions. There is one other thing that bolsters the idea that at some point in our distant past an extraterrestrial race inhabited our moon. It is a Sumerian tale about the god Enki and his son Marduk, who took a sojourn on Luna. We will touch on that next time.
Yeah.